Hello there, everyone. So I've been reading a book this week by the English neurologist Oliver Sacks called An Anthropologist on Mars, and I thought that the first chapter of this book was really interesting, especially in light of what we were talking about in the last video concerning alternative ways of processing visual art. And this first chapter details the case of an artist who reached out to Oliver Sacks, who in the book goes by the name of Mr. I. And Mr. I was involved in a car crash which rendered him completely colorblind, so he was an artist that went colorblind. And I wanted to talk about this case to you today because I think that it says some really interesting things about how changes to our sensory appreciation of the world can intimately affect other areas of our life, such as our identity. And as we go through this, I'm going to be reading directly from passages in the book, so let's begin where Oliver Sacks is describing what happened to Mr. I right after the accident had happened. We learnt that his accident had been accompanied by a transient amnesia. He had been able, evidently, to give a clear account of himself and his accident to the police at the time that it happened, late on the afternoon of January the 2nd. But then, because of a steadily mounting headache, he went home. He complained to his wife of having a headache and feeling confused, but made no mention of the accident. He then fell into a long, almost stuporous sleep. It was only the next morning, when his wife saw the side of the car stove in, that she asked him what had happened. When she got no clear answer, "I don't know, maybe someone backed into it," she knew that something serious must have happened. Mr. I then drove off to his studio and found on his desk a carbon copy of the police report. He had had an accident, but somehow, bizarrely, had lost his memory of it. Perhaps the report would jolt his memory, but lifting it up, he could make nothing of it. He saw print of different sizes and types, all clearly in focus, but it looked like Greek or Hebrew to him. A magnifying glass did not help. It simply became large Greek or Hebrew. This is where Mr. I first realised that his visual processing had been affected, even though he suffered no other immediate injury from the accident. And I think that this alexia, or inability to read, is important because it demonstrates how much actually goes into reading something. These letters on the screen are essentially variations of abstract markings, arranged into deliberate formations. But we don't actually see writing as that, because each of these markings corresponds to multiple domains of our intelligence simultaneously. We obviously see something as important first of all. We then frame what has been seen into a context. Meaning, broader associations, personal memory, visual memory, and also sonic associations. We hear a voice that is silently saying the words as we scan over them. We may also experience a kind of synesthesia, associating certain letters or formations of letters to different types of colour. All of these variables are like instruments in an orchestra that harmonise to produce the dynamic ability of reading. And just like a real orchestra, if one of these instruments is playing out of sync or gets taken out completely, it can potentially disrupt the entire composition. Now returning back to the case study. Mr. I decided to get checked out with the doctor. However, as hard as it is to believe, he had no appreciation of his colour loss until he returned to his art studio the next day. It was there, but like the reading, something wasn't registering at the level of the brain, and so he didn't notice it. In a passage from the book, it says, "He found his entire studio, which was hung with brilliantly coloured paintings, now utterly grey and void of colour. His canvases, the abstract colour paintings he was once known for, they were now greyish or black and white. His paintings, once rich with associations, feelings, meanings, now looked unfamiliar and meaningless to him. At this point, the magnitude of his loss overwhelmed him. He had spent his life as a painter. Now even his art was without meaning. and he could no longer imagine how to go on. This type of colour blindness is called achromatopsia, and it began to significantly affect other areas of his life as well. People became these uncanny objects. Their flesh was still ripe with all of the fidelity and texture, but it had now become a pallid grey, like animated grey statues, as Mr. I called them. And this influenced the way that he related to these people. The uncanniness of the experience made him shun social interaction, and he became a hermit. His intimate interactions with his wife came to a halt. He couldn't bring himself to intimate with somebody that had changed so profoundly. He talks about the wrongness of everything. He found foods disgusting due to their greyish dead appearance and had to close his eyes to eat. But this did not help very much, for the mental image of a tomato was as black as its appearance, thus unable to rectify even the inner image, the idea of various foods. He turned increasingly to black and white foods, to black olives, to white rice, black coffee and yogurt. His own brown dog looked so strange to him now that he even considered getting a Dalmatian. What I think so fascinating about this most of all is how his colourblindness bled into his imagination, into his mental life. It wasn't simply his sensory experience was affected. When he tried to imagine something, it was in black and white. And also in the book, it talks about how his dreams became black and white, which indicates to me that there must be some causality between the areas in the visual cortex responsible for vision and the imagination and our capacity to dream. If we can be affected so that even our imagination and our dream life becomes as greyed out as what we experience at our conscious level, then it certainly advances the intriguing possibility that there is some intimacy between these areas of our organism and our psychological life. Watching colour television became a problem for Mr. I too. A pure black and white television did help things somewhat, but colour images were too noisy and were represented in a very confusing way to his brain. You see, it's nearly impossible for us to imagine what this must be like. It's not just like living in a black and white movie. That would be easier to work with because all of the tonalities and form structures are worked out properly. What Mr. I was experiencing is a bit beyond that. The absence of colour would influence our moods, our tastes, literally the way that we taste things, the way that we relate to the most familiar, mundane items in our visual world would be re-architected. It would almost be like entering into a completely different dimension. In the book, it tells us one of the odd ways that he went about trying to rectify this. His despair of conveying what his world looked like, and the uselessness of the usual black and white analogies, finally drove him to create an entirely grey room, a grey universe in which tables, chairs, and an elaborate dinner ready for serving were all painted in a range of greys. The effect of this in 3 dimensions and in a different tonal scale from the black and white that we are accustomed to was indeed macabre and wholly unlike that of a black and white photograph. As Mr. I pointed out, we accept black and white photographs or films because they are representations of the world, images that we can look at or look away from when we want. But black and white for him was a reality all around him, 360 degrees, solid and 3-dimensional, 24 hours a day. The only way that he could express it, he felt, was to make a completely grey room for others to experience. But of course, he pointed out, the the observer himself would have to be painted grey, so he would be a part of the world and not just observing it. More than this, the observer would have to lose, as he himself had, the neural knowledge of colour. It was, he said, like living in a world moulded in lead. All of this, understandably, was extremely distressing for Mr. I. In the first weeks of his condition, he was so upset about this that he became suicidal. Though it makes it even more significant when we consider that he was an artist. He relied on the optimal functioning of his visual cortex and his eyes to commit to the activities that he had spent his entire life engaging with. He used to paint backgrounds in Hollywood in the 1940s. He was an expressionist in the 1950s. He had made his entire life around art, which is to say, by deeper extension, he made his entire life around seeing things in colour. And now that had been destroyed, he didn't know how he could go on living. He was also understandably worried, due to all of the sensory perturbations that were happening around him, that this condition might lead into other forms of psychological dysfunction, such as a psychosis or something like that. But after this initial wave of the dilemma, things started to slowly change for him. His mind started to gradually acclimatise to the possibility that this was its new normal. His initial sense of helplessness started to give way to a sense of resolution. This resolution was strengthened by a singular experience about 5 weeks after his accident. As he was driving to the studio one morning, he saw the sunrise over the highway. The blazing reds all turned into black. He said, "The sun rose like a bomb, like some enormous nuclear explosion. Had anyone ever seen a sunrise in this way before?" Mr. I started to appreciate the intriguing possibilities of this new mode of seeing, and began translating that into new black and white works of art. In fact, it was his supreme talents as an artist that contributed largely to his new sense of appreciating a greyed-out world. His interest and specialised knowledge for a coloured world now got carried over and poured into this new grey dimension. It was like seeing all over again. Oliver Sacks talks about this metamorphosis of perception brilliantly in the book. Colour perception had been an essential part not only of Mr. I's visual sense, but his aesthetic sense, his sensibility, his creative identity, an essential part of the way he constructed his world. And now colour was gone, not only in perception, but in imagination and memory as well. The resonances of this were very deep. At first he was intensely, furiously conscious of what he had lost. He would glare at an orange in a state of rage, trying to force it to resume its true colour. He found himself now not only in an impoverished world, but in an alien, incoherent, and almost nightmarish one. But then, with the apocalyptic sunrise and his painting of this, came the first hint of a change, an impulse to construct the world anew, to construct his own sensibility and identity anew. He started to be redefined by what had happened to him, redefined physiologically, psychologically, aesthetically, and with this there came a transformation of values, so that the total otherness, which at first had such a quality of a horror and a nightmare, came to take on for him a strange fascination and beauty. There was a lessening concern with what he had lost, and indeed with the whole subject of colour, which at first had so obsessed him. Indeed, he now spoke of being divorced from colour. He could still speak fluently about it, but there seemed to be a certain hollowness to his words, as if he were drawing only from past knowledge and no longer understood it. He had in some ways started to resemble a person born colourblind. In the second year after his injury, he saw best in subdued light or twilight. He started becoming a night person, in his own words, and took to exploring other cities, other places, but only at night. He would drive at random to Boston or Baltimore, or to small towns or villages, arriving at dusk, and then wandering about the streets for half the night, occasionally talking to a fellow walker, occasionally going to little diners. He said, "Everything in diners is different at night, at least if it has windows. The darkness comes into the place, and no amount of light can change it. They are transformed into night places. I love the night time. Gradually I am becoming more of a night person. It's a different world. There's a lot of space. You're not hemmed in by the streets, by people. It's a whole new world. I feel better now because I know then that I'm not a freak, and I have developed an acute night vision. It's amazing what I see. I can read license plates at night from 4 blocks away." Oliver Sacks continues to write, "One wonders whether his night vision might, with time, have taken on a heightened function in compensation for the damage to his colour system. There might, at this stage, also have been a heightening of movement sensitivity, perhaps of depth sensitivity. Although Mr. I does not deny his loss, at some level still mourns it, he has come to feel that his vision has become highly refined, privileged, that he sees a world of pure form, uncluttered by colour. He no longer thinks of colour, pines for it, grieves its loss. He has almost come to see his achromatopsia as a strange gift, one that has ushered him into a new state of sensibility and being. In this his transformation is exceedingly similar to that of John Hull, who after 2 or 3 years of experiencing blindness as an affliction and curse, came to see it as a dark paradoxical gift, a concentrated human condition, one of the orders of human being." When I was reading all of this, I couldn't help but compare what had happened to Mr. I with the accounts of radical consciousness alteration experiences. Mr. I had not taken a drug or interpreted his condition as anything mystical, and yet all the key components were still there. A perturbation of sensory and conscious experience, a loss and then restoration of selfhood, and finally a radical re-evaluation of what it meant to be human. I think that Mr. I's experience of the black sunrise was symbolic for him. It seemed to atomize a life once lived and usher in a completely new one, replete with its own conditions for life, value, and meaning. In fact, what's so amazing about all of this is when one of Oliver Sacks' colleagues talked about the possibility of retraining other parts of Mr. I's brain to compensate for the deprivation in the colour part of his visual cortex, and possibly, maybe, help to restore a part of what had been lost to him. In the first months after his injury, he said, he would have embraced such a suggestion, done everything possible to be cured. But now that he conceived the world in different terms, and again found it coherent and complete, he thought the suggestion unintelligible and repugnant. Now that colour had lost its former associations, its sense, he could no longer imagine what its restoration would be like. Its reintroduction would be grossly confusing, he thought, might force a welter of irrelevant sensations upon him, and disrupt the now re-established visual order of his world. He had been for a while in a sort of limbo. Now he had settled, neurologically and psychologically, for the world of achromatopsia. This case study that we've been looking at by Oliver Sacks about Mr. I's metamorphosis from a world of colour to a world without is so poignant of not just how much colour or its absence influences the rest of our conscious life, but also how alterations in our sensory activity influence the brain to reconstruct our sense of identity and sense of meaning in the world. It really drives home the plasticity of our identity and how our brain always, under any condition, tries to regulate a consistent image of the world and self. Recent developments in neurology have shown that this plasticity is confirmed at the level of the cerebral cortex, indicating that consistent alterations at certain levels of our experience modulate the impressions of our body image in the brain. Oliver Sacks was saying in the book how people who are blind and rely on reading from Braille with their finger leads to an augmentation of that reading finger's representation in the cortex. With this in mind, if we consider how many people globally are using smart devices, we are literally reprogramming our neurological structure by consistently interacting with these devices every day, and what that will do to our sense of self in the long term is a worthy subject to consider. I think that you could say as much about the interrelationship between identity and technology as you could about identity and sensory dynamics in the brain, because both cross-pollinate into the other. And it's cases like Mr. I's that really illustrate that none of our biological or psychological activity should be taken for granted. An area about the size of a bean was affected in Mr. I's brain, and it led to a dramatic restructuring at the level of his sense of self and how he related to his existence. So I think I'll leave it there. I'd like to do more of these case studies, examples in the future. I really like making them. And if I find any that are worthwhile, I'll definitely make a new video on them. Though for now, oh yeah, one more important thing as well. Just a reminder about the book that I've been reading from today. It's called An Anthropologist on Mars by Oliver Sacks. You can get this on Amazon or wherever else you get your books from. I would highly recommend this one. It's fascinating. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there now. So I'll simply say what I always say. Thanks very much for watching. And as usual, I'll see you again.